Once Europe whispered the word Mongol, like a charm against the night. But in one iron winter the whisper turned to laughter. Tonight, watch how the Invincible were unmasked, and how farmers learned to hunt the hunters. If you love deep history twists, subscribe, drop a like, and share this saga so more people find it. The winter of 1259 did not come softly. It arrived like a mailed fist across the face of Poland, hammering the plains into an anvil of frozen light and wind that sang through bare branches. On a grey morning, peasants out to check traps and fence lines found a sight so strange it slid past terror into a kind of grim comedy. Men and horses, upright and glassy with ice, as if a sculptor had frozen the moment of riding and refused to thaw it. Their eyes, those of the riders and the mounts, were filmed with frost, the lashes white, the irises pale and distant. Ravens had already done their unembarrassed work. The villagers did not scream. They did not run. They stared, then shrugged, then set up kettles and braziers and little makeshift stalls, because a winter's day permits no waste, not even of shock. It is said that fear turns first into ritual, then into habit, and finally, if you can survive long enough, into contempt. For 2 decades, Europe had dreamed in hooves. The name Mongol dragged behind it a comet's tail of memories. Towns that died with their church bells still ringing. Fields stripped to a green skeleton by grazing columns of remounts. Legends of cups carved from skulls and counting sacks filled with ears. Mothers hushed children with the story of riders who ate distance for breakfast and were never too far to find you by dusk. There had been battles where chivalry shattered like spun glass, where the arrow storm mocked armor, where speed itself seemed to be a theology. The Mongols were not merely enemies. They were a principle of the world, like wind or drought. But on that winter day, the principle faltered. People warmed their hands over fires while the dead stood in the field, a tableau of the empire that had ridden too far into a season it thought it understood. Children tossed snow into frozen faces and ran away shrieking, half fear and half glee. Dogs lifted legs without ceremony. An enterprising baker strung a crude placard from a stiff arm and sold loaves, grinning as he told anyone who would listen that his bread contained no human flour, unlike the fables about steppe cuisine. Bitter humor is the right of survivors. No one felt the need to prove courage. Contempt was cheaper and warmer. Beneath that surface mockery, however, something larger had matured. You can only be broken so many times before you begin to study the hammer. Knights had ridden and died and ridden again, and the old grammar of banners and charges and vows had learned humility. The Polish nobles and those who advised them had spent years counting not only losses but patterns. That army on the horizon was not a storm sent by God. It was a living system. And like every system, it had dependencies so central that removing one could collapse the rest. The dependency was 4-legged and tireless. A Mongol warrior was a many-saddled equation, 5, sometimes 10 remounts tethered to his prowess, a moving bank account of speed and endurance. Horses were shelter and food and weapon and map. Milk, blood, leather, glue, sinew, and sudden acceleration. You could not duel such a creature on terms of your choosing. He wrote his own terms with distance and picked his battlefield with hooves. So Poland began to plan not for honor, but for entropy. How to thin grass into ash, how to turn water into deceit, how to make the countryside a blank page that refused ink. Boleslaw the Chaste, they called the duke who convened councils and listened more than he spoke. The epithet would sound ironic to future chroniclers who loved to bruise reputations with jokes, but for now it meant an austere man with a taste for patience. He had knights, of course. Europe always had knights, but he also had foresters who could glide between trunks without breaking a twig, millers who knew where streams went even in winter, charcoal burners who could follow smoke backwards through a forest to its source. He had old women who understood which herbs turned a strong man's stomach to knots, and young shepherds who could vanish with an entire flock before dusk. He had the geography itself, its quiet lanes and marshy troughs and gullies like traps laid by time. So the country prepared, not with a shout, but with a long, low breath. Fields were harvested to the root and then scarred with fire. Meadows were dusted with lime. Wells were fouled in ways only the locals could later undo. Food vanished underground. Cattle wandered farther than any raiding party could track. Villages rehearsed disappearance, the bell tower silent, doors unbarred and swinging, ashes cold. What the enemy would see, they decided, was not an army in formation, but a horizon that refused to feed them, and a population that refused to be visible. When the riders finally came, they expected the old dance, banners glittering. A few brave charges, panic, plunder, flight. Instead, they found a map erased. Even the dead, the villagers swore later, had been politely disinterred so their bones could not be ground for calcium or ritual. The message was not subtle. It was a thesis. You do not live here. Your speed does not rule here. Your horses are welcome to try our winter. And at the edge of every wood, in the blue hush before dawn, men with farmers' hands closed around cords and blades and waited for the thing that would make all the difference. The soft, living breath of a horse, cliffhanger, the steppe empire lived by motion. Poland was about to take motion away, not with one blow but with 1,000 small vanishings. There are wars of swords and wars of granaries. Poland chose the second and discovered it was the first in disguise. Months before the first scout crested the riverbank, messengers spread through parishes with instructions that sounded like parables. Harvest clean, then make it as if you never planted. Draw water, then give the well a flavor only a local can forget. Leave a barn standing, but empty it as if the wind learned pockets. Those who had learned to survive winters learned to weaponize them. The result was an empire of absence, stretching across fields that once fed armies. The keystone of the strategy was not merely to deny fodder, but to invert temptation. Beautiful mares, sleek and apparently wild, were turned loose near fordable rivers, on the edges of groves in places where tired scouts would believe in luck. They were luck of a sort, the kind that arrives with a cough. Glanders had many names in many tongues, all of them uncomfortable. It traveled by breath, by shared tack, by the brush of a neck against a flank. The disease did not need to kill quickly. It needed only to slow hooves to a miserable walk and turn remount pools into reservoirs of contagion. A cavalry whose doctrine was rotation could not rotate without spreading its own ruin. When the first columns crossed the Vistula and saw the black rime of burned stubble, the officers understood logistics before they tasted fear. Armies can steal, but they cannot conjure. Carts rattle lighter if there is nothing to put on them. Fields that had fed cows now fed nothing. Flocks were gone. Even the private economies of villages, the pickled cabbage, the little hidden cheeses, the root cellars under false floors, had moved like migrating birds. Scouts returned with news that sounded like riddles. The roads are good but go nowhere. The houses stand but are not homes. The water is clear but then it isn't. Night brought the first cuts. The raiding parties were peasant-sized, a handful of men who could sleep standing up, move in pairs without whispering, and return to a rendezvous point by the smell of pine alone. They did not throw themselves against guards. They did not show themselves at all. A picket dreamed, a moon slid behind a cloud, and a horse's warmth left the world in a hiss that was almost tender. 5 ropes, 5 blades, 5 damp patches darkening snow. Men woke into a silence that explained everything. In the East, a warrior without a horse was not a warrior. In the Polish winter, he was not even a traveler. Panic is a solvent that loosens all doctrine. Commanders ordered the sick remounts to the rear, which is to say they put the disease behind them where the reserve herd lived, and behind that the baggage, and behind that the tenuous promise of pursuit. In 3 days, coughs became chorus. In a week, scouts stopped chewing their rations and started chewing their doubts. In 2, the wolves began to tail the column in leisurely arcs, knowing that meat was now marching itself to them with admirable discipline. The earth itself was in on the plot. Trenches were cut into the snow-skimmed fields, where it made sense to camp. Pits were lined with brush and then powdered with a dusting of fresh fall, until they became the visual twin of safety. A rider's eye learns to trust patterns, the gateway between 2 oaks, the look of a good leeward bank, but Poland had turned pattern into trap. Even when no one fought, the land fought. And then there were the gifts no commander wanted to refuse, small caches of food that looked like luck. A barrel of mead half buried in snow, the lid iced shut and yet not so tight. A stack of grain sacks in an otherwise empty shed. Smoked meat hung where the wind hadn't found it. None of it killed at once. It stole mornings. Stomachs turned mutinous. Archers wiped their mouths and pretended no one saw. Officers took to tasting, then spitting, as if prudence could outpace chemistry. The army did not halt. It slowed, which is worse for people who live by momentum. Rumors are a second disease, and they travel faster. The peasants vanish into trees. The water eats the throat. The horses dream of blood. A captain wrote what he dared and left the rest between the lines. We conquer empty space, and the space wins. Even the most hardened began to imagine eyes behind every twig. Sleep is a kind of surrender. Men stopped surrendering. The night grew longer. The Polish plan was not to offer a single decisive engagement, but to make the enemy fall forward into one. Every day the invaders pushed after a shadow. Every day the shadow lengthened. Always on the horizon, or around a bend or over a low rise, there seemed to be banners that might mean a stand. Each time the stand dissolved into retreat, and the retreat drew the pursuers closer to a place where waiting had been stitched into the ground like thread. This is how you unnerve riders who fear no charge. You take away sleep, then certainty, then the simple trust that water is water and bread is bread. You show them a map and then erase it each morning. You turn a horse from a promise into a question, and when questions outnumber answers, armies look backward as often as they look ahead. That is when you point them toward a city that looks like fate and let the roads do the rest. Cliffhanger. By the Vistula stood Sandomierz, banners, lines, a stage set to look like yesterday. The audience did not know the stage could bite. Sandomierz wore its winter like armor. Rooflines edged in ice, the river a slow knife. To the approaching columns, the city promised the comfort of familiarity. Here at last, a European army willing to meet in the old grammar. Knights up front, infantry behind, standards rising like stitched prayers against the sky. The invaders had played this song before. The first notes, feigned retreat, teasing pursuit, arrow crescendos, had toppled choirs of steel. It was reasonable then to lean into memory. But Sandomierz was not a memory. It was a set. For weeks, carpenters and ditchers, rope makers and hunters had etched geometry into the ground and then covered it with winter's veil. Trenches ran where a gallop would naturally collect. Pits waited under artful skins of brush and frost. Stakes slept inside their innocent graves, tipped with filth so that any scratch could bloom into fever. The day before the show, men with farmers' patience walked the field like gardeners, checking every seam, tugging every disguise. War is theatre when you want it to be. That day it was carpentry first and choreography second. At first the script obeyed expectation. Light cavalry floated into view, dangled their backs like bait, and flowed away with that casual grace that makes a chase feel inevitable. The defenders did not bite. They tightened shields. They let more arrows fall in the quiet between breaths. That refusal was the first line in a new play. The invaders wheeled for the arrow storm and found their angles wrong. Slopes and ditches had been chosen to warp trajectory, so the familiar arcs fell short or long, clattering into uselessness or burying themselves in a crust of snow that looked thicker than it was. Then the ground woke. A charge that began as a ripple turned into a series of swallowing. Hooves punched through thin snow and found air. Ankles folded. Animals screamed, a terrible sound that turns men smaller. Horses toppled forward into pits and riders followed, the two separating in mid-fall like an oath broken in the mouth. Where the ditches were not deep, they were sly, just enough to snap rhythm, to pile momentum into panic, to turn a line into a clot. From the city margins and hedgerows, the crossbowmen rose like punctuation marks in a dense paragraph. They did not aim for flourish. They aimed for function. Hooves again, shoulders, girth straps. A cavalry without gallonable horses is a conversation out of breath. Each bolt shortened the sentence. Those who found footing tried to regroup in the old circles, shields overlapping, discipline doing its noble best. But everything about their equipment argued for a saddle. Lamella meant to flex with a gallop now pinched and dragged on foot. Helmets asked to see too much and saw too little. Bows that needed space found only angles. And then the numbers changed. The line between soldier and civilian thinned to a thread. Men came out carrying tools that were never meant to be banners of war. Grain flails that understood what rhythm does to resistance. Scythes whose curves knew how to harvest and how to hamstring. Hooks that had once dragged hay and now found other purchase. There was no single heroic moment, no duel to crown a chronicle. There was instead a wide, monotonous efficiency, the kind that makes milling grain a miracle of repetition, and on that day turned a battlefield into an assembly line of endings. The invaders were brave. We forget that at our peril. They tried to make new doctrine inside a storm, to pivot to archery circles, to push out skirmishers, to keep the center calm. But poison in the gut makes timing dishonest. The ground lied without shame. Every 3 steps, someone disappeared into a design the defenders had drawn weeks earlier by the light of a winter moon. Courage cannot fix physics. It can only color it beautifully. As the afternoon ripened, pockets of resistance shrank to hard little kernels and then ground away. Messengers trying to ride orders across the field found the field wanting them dead. A commander raised a flag that had once meant regroup here. The wind refused to lift it. Someone shouted for a charge that would never find speed. Everything about the scene said yesterday, and everything in it belonged to now. The last act was slow by design. The defenders did not need to be glorious. They needed to be thorough. Horses were finished first where they still stood, the bolts mercifully quick. The men who had relied on them stood very still afterward, an ancient reflex, the body thinking if it could become a tree, the axe might miss. No axe came. Instead, there was the soft agricultural percussion of flails and the sudden weighty hush of a hook doing its work well. Songs rose, not pretty, not cruel, just the kind of work songs that keep hands in time when the task is long. Later, people would retell the day with words sharper than truth, skulls stacked, ears counted. But the most enduring memory was the rhythm, a continent practicing patience until patience became a weapon. When the field stopped moving, Sandomierz looked like nothing at all. A wide place near a river, fences bitten by frost, the air tasting of iron. And yet it had changed the grammar of an empire on horseback. The lesson was blunt and portable. If speed is your god, the ground can be its heresy. Cliffhanger. Beyond Poland, on open fields without pits or snow, another experiment awaited, one that would prove the steppe could be checked even where the earth offered no traps. Open country should have favored the riders of the steppe. No hedgerows to hide a knife, no forest to swallow sound, no city wall to turn speed into a question. Between the Morava's glitter and the summer haze, the field near Kressenbrunn lay simple and honest, a canvas for momentum. The Bohemians and their allies answered honesty with geometry. They did not paint a line. They built a shape, hollow squares bristling with pikes, their corners anchored by men who measured courage not in shouts but in stance. Inside the squares, crossbowmen waited. Each bolter held breath, each mechanism a promise kept. Along the edges hovered cavalry, not to leap but to listen. The order of the day was patience. The genius of the plan was that patience would do the work of speed. Across the field, the invaders performed their familiar overture. Light cavalry swept forward and away, a tide that never quite reached the sand. Arrows described elegant arcs and fell like logic. But every arc met a surface designed to refuse it. Shields held at angles, armor that had learned from painful years, distances calculated, so that the bolts inside the squares could answer with flatter, truer lines. What had once been terror became arithmetic. The arrow storm lost height, lost sting, lost narrative. The horses tried next because horses obey what they were built to do. They came at the pike walls with hearts that had never doubted ground, only to learn that ground can grow teeth. Pike heads do not move fast. They do not need to. They wait, and then they declare the truth of space. The first ranks of chargers halted, not because they wished to, but because the math of distance and iron said so. So a cavalry charge is a chord played by hundreds of instruments. Break 1 or 2 instruments and you still have music. Break the rhythm, and you have a room full of sound that refuses to become song. Inside the squares, discipline turned into a kind of silence. The crossbowmen loaded, stepped, loosed. Loaded, stepped, loosed. No heroes flourish, no shouted names, just the steady syllables of a language designed for pressure. Their targets were not faces. They were functions. Shoulders that held a draw, hands that steered reins, the soft under of a horse that offered leverage to a rider, the exposed seam of a girth strap that could turn a mount into an anchor. Each bolt pared away advantage. Each measured volley reshaped the conversation. Commanders on the steppe side adapted as they always did. They sent probing wedges at perceived weak corners, tried to pull a square open with feints and sudden surges, sought to make one cohort panic, and thus crack the calm. But this army had rehearsed panic out of itself. Reserves bled into threatened points like mercury, flowing without drama, filling the shape and keeping it whole. Drums on one side called for velocity. On the other, a bell of restraint answered. Then came the long moment, the one every plan must reach when the enemy, having failed to win, has not yet chosen to quit. Bows had been emptied and refilled and emptied again. Horses were breathing hard, hot foam at the bit. Men on foot had taken to edging forward between the charges, testing, jabbing, looking for a seam. The air, heavy with heat and dust, felt like a held verdict. It is here that nerves fray. It is here that someone usually speaks out of turn, one rash charge, one unasked for pursuit, and the shape collapses into stories of almost. But the riders in reserve were led by people who could tell time. They watched the horizon of motion, the subtle shortening of the enemy's gallop, the loss of crispness in how a wedge turned, the slight sag in rider's posture that says the body is paying debts. And only then, without trumpet drama, the heavy cavalry rolled, armored men on trained destriers, moving like a patient tide over a beach that had forgotten its slope. This was not the straight-line bravery of legend. It was a pressure wave following a barometer's readings. They didn't seek a spectacular break. They pressed edges, chewed space, harried the flanks of units already winded by their own attempts. The pike walls advanced in measured steps, shrinking space for the enemy to reform. Crossbow fire shifted from defensive to opportunistic, nipping at clusters, trying to invent a new plan in the middle of a worse one. The field did not erupt. It settled. That is the hidden face of many victories, the moment the sky does not open, but the ground stops arguing. Cressenbrunn proved something Poland had hinted at, and Sandomierz had dramatized. That victory in this era was less about beautiful charges than about refusing to give the enemy the story he expected. The Europeans had not become the equals of the steppe at speed. They had become experts at management, of distance, of angles, of the human pulse under armor. They turned the plains into rooms with rules. And when the steppe warriors looked across and saw patience where they had counted on appetite, their doctrine found fewer handholds. When the day ended, there were no triumphal stacks of trophies for the storytellers to embroider. There were footprints telling how a shape held, and scuffed places in the dust where pressure had ground through resistance, and broken shafts littering the places where physics had flexed its ordinary, unromantic power. The legend of invincibility is nourished by suddenness. Cressenbrunn starved it by degrees. Cliffhanger. Beaten on planned ground and trapped on crafted ground, the invaders turned to the mountains for escape. But winter keeps books more carefully than any chronicler. The Carpathians do not roar. They decide. Ridges fold upon ridges, forests stitched to rock, passes like careful sentences. In summer, they are green problems for patient feet. In winter, they are judges. Those who fled into them after the plains taught their lessons found that the mountains had prepared their own curriculum. Villages along the lower slopes had listened to bells and rumors. They moved as communities move when they have learned the value of a day. Bridges taken down plank by plank and hidden in barns. Sledges dragged across passes to groove misleading tracks. Caches sealed under rock in places that only a child would think to check, because a child had hidden them years ago. The mountains are generous to those who know them, and perfectly indifferent to those who don't. At first, the retreat had momentum enough to feel like escape. Men still carried purpose in their shoulders. Orders still had verbs, but cold steel's grammar. The remnant force soon measured progress in aches and small decisions. Which slope means fewer slides, which turn of the stream means less ice, which stand of pines offers a windbreak worth the time. Scouts went ahead and returned smaller, words bitten off by the air. There were marks in the snow at night, quiet messages from eyes no one could find by day. The mountain folk did not need to stalk like heroes. They practiced subtraction. A felled tree left where a path narrows is not an obstacle. It is a calendar. What you can't pass in 10 minutes, you must warm for 2 hours. What you warm for 2 hours, you eat for 4. What you eat for 4, you must pay back with weight that slows you tomorrow. Delay compounds like debt. Small skirmishes did enough to remind the column that it was seen. Arrows found legs and arms at the edges of groups, then fell silent for a day, then came again from the other side. Not enough to break nerve, enough to make men look sideways when they should have been watching their footing. The night cold put its hand on throats. Fires were small because fires were eyes. Sleep was thin because sleep is confidence, and confidence was being spent. Men tried to save strength by silence, and found that silence has its own cost. Without talk, the mind loops. With looping, dread grows habits. Leaders counted rations and made all the right bad choices. Cut today's portion, promise tomorrow, move before dawn to buy an hour of firm crust on snow. The hour buys you distance. The cold demands interest. The mountains, meanwhile, wrote essays in ice. Streams that looked still were skin over knives. A wrong step was a book closed on a hand. Sledges improvised from shields promised to hurry the slow, then launched them into trees. Footing that seemed generous turned treacherous, where a thin drift hid old leaves. The men learned the hardest fact of winter geography. Vastness can be intimate. A single bend in a single gully can own your whole afternoon. When small villages chose to engage, they did so with the manners of their work. A hunter's bow is precise inside the width of a clearing. A boar spear understands momentum and how to meet it without surrendering an inch. Groups waited on ridgelines for hours to throw one sharp minute at a fatigued file, then disappeared into patterns of brush and rock they had rehearsed since childhood. There were no charges, only occurrences. The invaders bled time more than blood. Hunger revises ethics, but here the story does not need the lurid to be true. Dry rations turned to crumbs and then to arguments. Men overpromised their bodies and paid with injuries that the cold treated as permissions. Belts tightened become raw marks. Raw marks become a slower gait. A slower gait becomes distance. The column refuses to wait for. Refusal becomes separation. The wolves, brown-grey and unpoetic in daylight, stitch the spaces between groups with their own arithmetic. Nature does not gloat. It eats. When spring reached into the high places with its first indifferent fingers, it found what winter had settled. Scattered remnants. The remains of camps that had chosen the wrong hollow. Abandoned kit, where weight and will had quarreled and weight had won. Villagers went about their seasonal chores and included salvage in the list. Iron to be hammered into new shapes, leather to be mended into harness or shoes, a few coins that remembered far horizons and would now buy seed. What the mountains remembered was carried down as stories that erased varnish and left structure. No one narrated the end with crowns and culminations. They said the bells warned in time. The bridges were down. The passes were watched. The strangers found the cold that belongs to us, and not to them. That, in its quiet way, is a continent changing how it thinks of its own safety. You do not need castles if valleys can act like them. You do not need heroics if calendars can. By the time the survivors poured out of the high country in thin trickles, they were no longer an army. They were men looking for ground that would stop arguing with them. Behind them, the Carpathians had taught the last lesson. That strategy can be landscape, and landscape, when listened to and rehearsed with, becomes a defense more reliable than any oath. Cliffhanger. Word of these lessons travels faster than columns. The steppe will probe again, only to find not a single enemy, but a country that has learned to behave like one. Victory is not a single event. It is a habit you teach your neighbors. After the fields and the mountains finished their work, news rode out in many saddles. It carried fewer boasts than instructions. Build systems, not stories. Choreograph bells. Practice vanishing. Learn how your ground wants to fight. Courts listened in Prague and Vienna, in Krakow and beyond. The result was not one great army waiting behind a single gate, but many small agreements about what to do when hooves sounded where they shouldn't. So when a new raiding force tested the border, it met choreography. At a village church, a bellman pulled a rope and thereby pulled a landscape. The next steeple answered, and the next, until sound ran like water across 50 miles. Carts rolled into pre-arranged lanes. Flocks moved into woodlots that had been taught to receive them. Children played a game called quiet. On the roads, men who were not soldiers, riding horses that were not chargers, began to shadow the intruders. They struck in the hours the steppe had once owned, before dawn, after dusk, nicking at sentries, lifting remounts, turning wells into question marks. No stand, because a stand is a story the enemy recognizes. Instead, refusal. Raiding doctrine depends on implied speed, not just your ability to move, but the enemy's assumption that you will move again before he can organize. The new Europe made organization the first reflex. There were no hysterical pursuits that left towns naked behind. There were relay points handing information to the next hamlet. There were caches that meant no one had to improvise at the worst moment. The raiders found themselves oxygenated with fear, drinking carefully, sleeping shallowly, eating suspiciously. They were not outnumbered. They were outsustained. Along frontiers where professional orders patrolled, severity grew craft, not spectacle. The Teutonic habit of reconnaissance sharpened into a method for making distance unwelcoming. Capture a scout, map his route through him, send him back if you must, with a message stitched into the horizon he can no longer trust. Elsewhere, barons with rougher tempers made examples that traveled via rumor and did the work of 10 patrols. But underneath the hard veneer lay something softer and more consequential: expectation. Villages expected to help themselves first. Lords expected to be second. Not saviors, but amplifiers. That inverted 1,000-old imaginations about who keeps whom safe. The raiding column that pushed a day too far got a lesson in attrition as pedagogy. Every ahead-of-schedule camp they made turned into a behind-schedule morning. A horse taken in the night meant not just one rider slowed, but a gap that reconfigured supply. When they turned back, because even the bold must choose a later day, they discovered that retreat is movement without narrative. The same bells ushered them out that had ushered them in, with the same cool efficiency. Along a ridge, children gathered, not to scream insults, but to practice a new normal. A short refrain about farmers who had learned the land's old secrets and used them correctly. Not every aftermath became a monument, but some did, and even the monuments learned modesty. Churches rebuilt foundations with stone that had a different taste in the mortar. A trace chemistry that future scholars would puzzle over without needing the old brags. Market towns adopted tools first used in crisis: larger granaries with hidden compartments, wells with stone collars designed to be sealed quickly, roads that could be made to vanish into fields with a day's ploughing. People kept living, which is the quietest triumph. In the East, watchers of empires measured the new information too. The tale of invincible cavalry that unstitched kingdoms overnight now had footnotes: forests that did not panic, squares that did not open, rivers whose fords whispered to locals first, mountains that were polite only to those who knew their names. A story can survive a defeat. It cannot survive a better story. Young riders hearing campfire talk about Europe now heard logistics discussed with the same gravity as valor. The steppe had always honored speed. It began late and reluctantly to fear friction. Archaeology, centuries later, would find the residue of these years like careful pencil marks in the margins of history. Altered toolheads, designed less for fields than for contingencies. Layers in rural foundations with calcium signatures that made scholars argue about what crises do to judgment. Caches of bolts in parish outbuildings. A standardization of bell towers, out of all proportion to purely liturgical need. These are not the debris of one great battle. They are the fingerprints of a strategy made civic. And the myths die like stars. Slowly, then all at once, and even after they die, their light keeps traveling. For a time, people far away still flinched at the name of the horsemen. Then their cousins returned from the west, with stories of traps that looked like fields, of shapes that ate charges, of bells that outran hooves. Confidence migrated. The aura of inevitability, once the steppe's greatest ally, lost the habit of arriving ahead of its armies. That is all any continent needs to begin choosing its future again. In the end, no one wrote an epic about bells and trenches and patient squares because epics prefer a single bright stroke. But houses stood where they might have burned. Children learned games instead of lessons in flight. Fields ripened on time. People remembered a simple set of truths that any generation can use. Learn the enemy, then teach the land. Deny what he must have, not what he can endure. Practice before you are forced to perform. Those truths outlived the riders who had once seemed to own the horizon. If this series reshaped how you picture medieval warfare, from glorious charges to quiet systems, hit subscribe, like and share so more people find it. Tell me in the comments which lessons surprised you most: the squares, the bells, or the mountains.